All right, good morning, all of you. So glad to have you here, and really happy for our embedded ethics lecture for the semester. I think I think you all will recognize that as AI and ML begins to work, we really need to think through the ethics of the technology. And I think, there's ethics around every technology. There's ethics around the way you design cars or the way you design um, I know, it's probably ethics around the way you design a chair if you think about it. But I think that the way I think about this is that as technology is used for making decisions, whether it's automated decisions or helping people make decisions, that that raises the bar around the importance of thinking through what decision is it leading an individual to make, or what decision is the technology itself making. Um, Same time, I also want to say, just from my viewpoint, that people are not perfect. Like we stereotype. If we just want to think about stereotyping, we stereotype, and I believe that technology can help to lead to better decisions. So anyway, this is a very rich area. It's a very interesting area. It's a place where there's been lots of technical debate within the computer science community about the right types of definitions for things like fairness. What does it mean to be fair? And I've come to develop the viewpoint that while we might think as technologists, as computer scientists, that we should sit on the side, but it's okay to sit on the side of the ethical debate of the philosophy. I think we cannot do that because I think that the scholars, the experts on that side of the table are not going to be able to be competent enough and technically sophisticated enough to understand the algorithms. So we both need to be trying to lean into each other. And that's why that's what I've come to believe. If you'd have asked me 2 years ago, I'd have said, leave this to the other side. I don't know. Does that resonate with you, Finale?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we can stand on the side because I mean, these small decisions can have such huge consequences. If you're a programmer on a team that's rolling out, voice recognition software, and it consistently gets certain accents or types of speech, certain words even that belong to a particular ethnic or racial group wrong, no one's going to be checking, right? Except you. You're going to be the one who knows that it has problems. You're the one who's going to know that it might have problems, that, hey, this software isn't magical and it's just going to work on all types of speech. And so when I talk to people, like I do exec eds with people in government, and I tell them that, hey, you need to engage with your technical teams because your technical teams can build to a spec. And it's society's decision about what that spec should be, right? That this is a moral, they're moral choices and ethical choices that you're encoding when you do these things. And I think that for folks sitting on the other side, on the building side of this, knowing that we have to demand that from the people around us, right? We have to have the humility to know that we can't, we shouldn't be dictating for society what our choices should be, and to know that we are making those choices so that we are. You can't let your manager just tell you to build it and that's it. You have to ask, what are the implications? How do we think about this in the context of how it's going to be used?
Right. So we're really happy to be joined today by Lyndal Grant. She's a PhD student in the philosophy department at MIT. She works primarily in metaphysics and the philosophy of mind, and she spent the last 3 semesters on the embedded ethics team here at Harvard. I know that she would like this to be as participatory as possible. So those of you that are able to turn your cameras on, I know she would appreciate that. And we will be using some opportunities for you to get into smaller groups as well to chat. But we're going to hand over to Lyndal. So thank you for being here, Lyndal.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. And And yeah, I want to reiterate that I would love for this to be as sort of interactive as possible, not merely because, that helps mitigate the inevitable Zoom fatigue, but also because you guys know a lot of stuff that I don't know. I'm a philosophy student, you guys are CS students. So I would love, as I'm talking about certain theoretical concepts, for you guys to be able to chime in with examples that pop to mind, questions. So you can chime in either just by unmuting yourself and sort of interrupting at an opportune time, or perhaps you could digitally raise your hand, and I'll try to keep an eye on the various squares, or perhaps David and Fenella can also keep one eye on that so that people can ask questions. I'll stop at various stages to ask specific questions, but do feel free to interrupt me at any point so we can have a more wide-ranging discussion. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, everyone got that?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, great. Excellent. So I'm going to be talking today about discrimination, and about discrimination in the context of machine learning systems. Before we get into some of the more theoretical material to help us think through this, I want to get sort of a few examples on the table, so you guys might be able to help me with this. So there are lots of good cases of ML being able to both make more precise predictions than humans can, and to potentially be able to overcome certain kinds of human biases and prejudices. So, for example, judges are well known to be more harsh in their sentencing later in the day than earlier in the day. So judges in some ways seem to have an early day favorable bias. The assumption is that judges probably, as the day goes on, suffer a kind of fatigue. They hear a new case and then they're like, send him to jail. I'm sure it's not quite that flippant, but something like that. If there were algorithmic tools to help them make decisions in a more principled way, then some of that arbitrariness and seeming unfairness would be taken out of the equation. And surely that would be a good thing. That would be a good case for machine learning. Here's a bad case. So Amazon, until not too long ago, was using an algorithm for hiring that scanned resumes of applicants and helped to select the most employable or likely successful applicants for various kinds of jobs. It was discovered that the algorithm was discounting the qualifications of anyone whose resume featured the word women or women's. So people who came from a women's college, who participated in women's sports teams, for example. And the reason this was thought to have happened was because the training data was taken from job evaluations of employees at Amazon. So there'd been a kind of either bias in the way that employees at Amazon had been assessed for jobs, or there'd been a kind of bias in who was hired for jobs at Amazon to begin with, such that we have here what looks like a patent case of algorithmic discrimination. So women's resumes were not given the same kinds of consideration as men's, purely in virtue of the fact that they were women. That looks like a clear case of something like discrimination. Let me present you with something like a puzzle case for you to discuss. Suppose that the age at which someone starts computer programming is strongly correlated with future success as a software engineer at Google. The following, I think, definitely used to be true. It might still be true, but it used to be the case that on average, boys tend to start programming earlier than girls. Here's the question that I'd like to put to you, just to sort of begin to get us thinking about these kinds of cases, sort of rev up our brains a little bit. Would it be discriminatory for Google to use the age at which someone starts programming as part of their basis for deciding which software engineers to hire? So in thinking about this question, I'm going to get you into breakout rooms to think about it and discuss it. I want you to sort of, drawing on the reading that was for this class, the Barocas and Selbst Big Data's Disparate Impact paper, think about the following questions. So would this be illegal by the lights of disparate treatment or disparate impact law? It seems like from your responses, most of you had a really good grasp on what that was. But secondly, and potentially independently of this question, would it be unfair, even if it would be legal? So David and Finale, if you could get people into breakout rooms.
Yep.
I'll give you guys about 5 minutes to discuss it, and then I'm going to get you guys to report back what your groups had discussed.
And we'll also try to get the prompt into a Google Doc and share that link with you into your rooms as well. We'll work on that while you're in your rooms. All right, we will bring you all back in a few minutes. Oh no, what happened? Did we send? Okay. Lyndal, did we send you into a breakout room?
You did, but I quickly exited.
Oh, that's funny, because your co-host and maybe Finale got sent into a breakout room too. That's never happened before.
I was also sent away, yeah.
Oh, wow, okay. Can we quickly throw up your text into a Google Doc if sure, maybe that's something we can try to pull off on the fly? I just think, you know what you might do actually going forward, if you have additional things, you can share your slides with Nari and she can make an additional Google Doc for any other questions.
I see. I don't think I have any other questions that
that's
are going
to. Okay.
I sort of like using groups at the very beginning because sometimes people are reticent to talk in the large group.
Great.
I don't know how to.
Do you have a simple? I mean, if you just show it up on the screen, we can also just type it to people. Let's just do that. Okay. Just share it again, and I'll just chat it.
I think that would work. Can I send it to you in the chat, Nari?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can put it in a doc, David.
All right, but I can also type if we just get it up again. I don't see the prompts anymore.
Thank you for sending it. Yeah, Lyndal DM'd it to me.
You got it? Great.
Yeah, here it is. I'll paste it in a doc really quickly and send it.
I'm just gonna also chat it to everybody right now.
Perfect.
Yeah, I hadn't realized until recently that when students go into breakout rooms, they can no longer see my slides. So kind of obviates the point of having the questions there up on the slides.
Yeah.
Oh, David, I'm gonna interrupt your stream. Can you see my broadcast?
Yeah, I saw it. That's much better.
Okay. Can you click on it when I broadcast it? Should I do it again?
Do it again.
Okay, cool.
Oh, so I see. So people won't actually be able to grab the text. Oh, actually, maybe it is going to let me click.
Send the text to everyone in the chat.
Yeah, that's what I was doing, but the chat only lets you send a couple of sentences at a time. Oh no!
Oh well, it's okay. They probably remember.
They probably. I mean, these are smart students.
Hopefully, they have better memory than I do.
It's also at around this point that I realize this is all being recorded while they're in the chat. We'll try. Coming back.
Okay. Let me just make this grid a little bigger. Okay, everyone's back?
Yep.
Great. Would anybody like to volunteer a particularly interesting thought or idea or question that the group came up with, or was there a consensus or sharp disagreement? Just raise your digital hand.
If you want, you can feel free to reflect on the conversation that happened in your breakout room. You don't need to speak to a consensus if that's too hard.
Yeah. Just give people a chance to respond. I read somewhere that on average, lecturers tend to wait 3 seconds after asking a question before answering it themselves. Because there is, when you're giving a lecture, this kind of like awkward silence, like, damn, did nobody like understand the question? Do they not know what's going on? But in fact, students, if you give them a bit longer, will tend to answer it themselves. But let me get us started by...
we do have a hand actually, Lyndal.
Great.
Yeah, we can go to Blake. Go ahead, Blake.
Okay, yeah. So I think my group came to the consensus that it probably wouldn't be illegal, but it would certainly be, it could very likely be unfair if you have a situation where age is kind of acting as a proxy for gender. And we were thinking that it probably would be illegal under Title IX regulations to look directly at gender. So maybe it's not illegal to look directly at age, but if it's acting as a proxy for another variable like gender, then might not be strictly illegal, but certainly unfair. Although we're not totally clear on like what the exact regulations are in terms of which variables you're allowed to use to discriminate.
Yeah, and this was something that came up in the reading, like the question of whether or not this kind of discrimination is illegal often hinges on whether or not there's a justified business reason to engage in this kind of discrimination. And this has changed over time. It used to be quite stringent what counted as a good business reason, and it's become more and more lax, such that anything sort of that provides a benefit to the business is seen as sort of a legitimate business interest. So though I'm no legal scholar, it might be the case that in fact this kind of discrimination would not count as discrimination in the legal sense, where it would be against the law. Because if we're assuming that Google has an interest in hiring the best software developers or coders, then, and that there is a strong relationship or some causal relationship between the age at which you start coding and your ability as a coder, then they have an interest in selecting for those people who started coding earlier. But nonetheless, people thought that it might be unfair even if it's legal. Why is that? Anyone?
Lyndal, you have another hand. Are you able to see the hands, or would you like me to, to call?
I have to toggle between screens a little bit, so I'm probably not as quick on the uptake.
Mariam has her hand up.
I don't know if I should go, but
go for it. Sorry, yeah.
Something else our group was wondering was whether this was inherently wrong, or whether it was wrong because of its proxy as a gender discriminator, because we could imagine other things that maybe seem more reasonable, like other factors like number of work or years of work experience, the university you went to. If those were found to be connected to gender, would those be put into question as well? Or...
Right. So those seem like more reasonable bases, you thought, but nonetheless, they might still be highly correlated with gender. Okay, yeah, interesting. Any other thoughts? David, if I can cold call on you, David Chen, he had some really interesting ideas in the group that I popped into. He was talking about whether or not the age at which you start coding really bears a causal relationship to your ability as a coder, and that might make a difference to whether or not it's unfair. Do you want to say a little more about that, David?
Yeah, sure. So basically what I was thinking was that like I think like normally it would be discrimination, and as long as like it is a sort of like correlation, then it pretty much is only just being used as a proxy variable, and like it's not actually telling us anything substantial about like the applicant. So I would be slightly more comfortable with like using this as a metric if there was some sort of direct causal relationship that was like well established between, you know, like starting to program at an early age and your ability later on. But I think another member of my group, Charumati, she brought up a good point too, and that like it would in a sense still be like stereotyping, in that like you'd still be applying sort of like a stereotype of the group to an individual, and you're not really still giving them the chance to sort of prove their ability, because like, you know, I think regardless of when you start programming, there's always a chance that like somebody who started a little later is still a very good programmer.
Right. So we're denying some individuals the opportunity to show that they do have the qualifications that they need, because they share a trait, namely not having started until later in life, with other people who may not have the qualifications needed. Yeah, interesting. Anyone else want to chime in before I move on to some more cases and thoughts? Okay. So, oh, we have a hand from Alexander.
Yeah, that's right. I had this thought. I wanted to hear your opinion about, so if we consider this hypothetical situation, and if we assume that, yes, the start age does correlate with gender, and then let's say there's an unbiased metric of performance that allows companies to hire equal numbers of male and female specialists of similar experience level, but then it would end up being that female specialists are on average older. And then it is known that software companies are discriminative against older aged specialists. How would that be handled?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure how legally it would be handled. I think that there are legal prohibitions against age discrimination, though there are, again, like business interested carve-outs for, businesses have an interest in keeping people on for a long time because it means that they save money on retraining new people. This is often, well, this can be used as a justification for not hiring women if they have a likelihood, if they think there's a likelihood that the women will end up taking maternity leave, then they'll need to hire someone else. So there's sort of like a business interest in some ways in not holding and not hiring older people, namely they're not going to be around for as long. So legally, I'm not quite sure how that would be dealt with. In terms of fairness, I think it's a bit of an open question. I mean, in some ways, some of you might come away from this lecture a little bit disappointed because I'm not providing a whole lot of answers or rubrics for thinking about whether or not some particular case is an instance of wrongful discrimination or not. What I'll be trying to give you is a series of distinctions and tools to help you think through the various cases yourselves and weigh up various kinds of competing considerations. So maybe we'll come back to you and see what you think about that case at the end of the lecture, Alex.
All right, thanks.
Awesome. Okay.
One more, Rebecca.
Yeah, I was wondering if this could be considered illegal under disparate impact, because it seems that age here is being used to measure how your ability as a programmer, and if another kind of test or something else could measure that just as accurately, like a technical interview, without having the same disparate impact on women, if that could be perhaps be considered illegal because there was like another method that could have been used that didn't discriminate against a protected group or to that level.
Yeah. So I think the article talked about something related to this in some detail, which was that there used to be a sort of standard that you can't use some discriminatory practice if there's some alternative non-discriminatory practice which would equally well serve the interests of the company or the organization. That's no longer, that's like quite a high bar, and that's no longer often applied in that kind of way. I mean, say a company hires some third-party company to create some algorithm for hiring. So they're creating an algorithm to sift through thousands of resumes, for example. Costs them a lot of money to buy this software. And they discover that this software has a kind of bias in it, though it does better than the humans who would have been doing the job without the software. There's a sense in which if they can't afford to invest the money in creating another algorithm, they don't have an alternative practice, which is non-discriminatory, which does the job just as well. But potentially they could invest the money. There is some such thing available where there to be more money poured into it, but it's just not available to them, given their business interests. So this is all sort of, in terms of the legal discussion, very changeable, and the context of machine learning, as the article brings out, is different from the context in which a lot of this legislation was crafted. And so machine learning in some ways presents new problems for both discrimination legislation and also just how we think about discrimination in general, which we'll get to in a moment. I'm not sure if that really spoke to your thought there, or... was sort of orthogonal.
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Great. So I seem to be moving on in my PowerPoint in a way that I didn't want to. Okay, so we've got some cases. There are clearly cases of discrimination that look bad. There are clearly cases of machine learning that look like it enables us to overcome certain kinds of problematic discrimination that would have been present had humans been doing the work. There are puzzle cases. So let's just step back from the examples a little bit to think about the more theoretical question: what is discrimination? So firstly, I just want to distinguish between discrimination understood in a neutral sense from discrimination understood in a moral or ethical sense. So when we're talking about discrimination in a neutral sense, there's a sense in which all actuarial reasoning, all statistical reasoning involves discrimination. What we're doing is making distinctions among items, whether those items be people, groups, objects, on the basis of the features that they have. We're trying to make predictions about them on the basis of features that they share with statistically similar items. And in this sense, it's not clear that there's anything wrong with discrimination. So consider a teacher who lines up their pupils on one side of the room from if their surname starts with the letters A through H, on the other side of the room if their surname starts with letters H through Z. The teacher is discriminating among students on the basis of features of their names. There's not obviously anything wrong with that kind of discrimination. Wrongful discrimination, so discrimination in the moral sense, is a philosophical notion which says not merely that discrimination is present and that it's wrong, but that something is wrong in virtue of being discriminatory. So for example, imagine we've got our teacher again, she's got her students lined up in two groups. Imagine she makes the students on one side of the classroom, the A through H students, go and scrub the toilets. And then she lets the other students have some treat. You might think that what she's doing is discrimination and what she's doing is wrong, plausibly because it's not okay to make students scrub the toilets and it's not okay to treat students differently on this kind of an arbitrary basis. But this isn't wrongful discrimination, although it's discrimination and it's wrong. So what we want to be thinking about is when is discrimination understood in this neutral sense, distinguishing among items, or in the case we're going to be focused on, distinguishing among people or groups. When is that kind of discrimination wrongful discrimination? And what does it look, what are the features of cases of discrimination such that they're wrongful in the way that an employer refusing to hire racial minorities is wrong? So that's kind of one of the main leading question that we're going to be thinking about. So,
Lyndal, yeah. Alex has a comment in the chat. He says, we know the names that start with certain letters are more common among certain cultures, so it's a proxy verb.
Ah, yeah, that's a very good point. I had not thought of that. Yeah. Yeah, so although the case that I've presented looks like, so there's another similar case which has that feature. So I was brainstorming with my fellow embedded ethics folks, cases of discrimination that look not problematic, although they're arbitrary. So apparently there was another hiring algorithm, I can't remember which company used it, that was discovered showed a preference for people whose names were Jared, because the training data had this freakish feature whereby there had been a lot of really successful Jareds in the company in the past. Now you could say, okay, so this algorithm is discriminating against non-Jareds. It's favoring Jareds. But is this wrongful discrimination? Well, you might think there's something about it that's unfair, but no, it's not wrongful discrimination. Alternatively, you might say, look, if you're a Jared, you're very likely to be a white dude. And so in fact, Jared, insofar as it's highly correlated with race and potentially also class, this might count as wrongful discrimination. So this brings us to the question of what discrimination is as opposed to just general kinds of unfairness. So discriminating between people on the basis of whether or not their name is Jared looks like a kind of unfairness. It's kind of arbitrary. It's not fair for people not to get a go at a job because their name isn't Jared. But it's not wrongful discrimination in the sense that we're interested in, because this is how we're going to understand discrimination. This is the particular kind of wrongness that discrimination, unfairness that discrimination is. So discrimination consists of actions, practices, or policies that impose a relative disadvantage to certain individuals based on social group membership. So discrimination is just one of many ways that an action, practice, or policy can be unfair. So it's something to keep in mind as we continue to talk through the rest of this lecture, that once we have secured that some practice or policy or algorithm isn't discriminatory, it doesn't follow that you're ethically in the clear, because it might still be unfair. So discrimination is just a subset of unfairness. Okay, so that's our working definition for the moment of discrimination. So a couple of things to notice about this.
There's a question in the chat asking about proxy variables, and asking whether they can be, like, how correlated do they have to be? You know, like how broad, how specific, relating to the 4/5 rule from the meeting.
Good, yeah, that is a really good question. How broad or specific do they have to be to count as discrimination, I assume?
That's right. Like if it's somewhat, if the Jared is, most often always this way, or the first letter is always this way, then maybe that's clear. But what if it's sometimes, more often than not?
Yeah.
Occasionally.
That is a really good question. I'm not sure that there is a univocal answer. I think this is probably something that we might get clearer on, or we might get clearer on why it's difficult as we go on. So definitely bring this up again if you feel like it hasn't been adequately addressed in the next 5 minutes. I think that certainly the issue of proxy variables is going to come up again, but yeah, feel free to bring, let me see if I can go on to the next slide and help you out with that. So just a couple of things to notice about this definition of discrimination. So firstly, discrimination is essentially comparative. So duties of non-discrimination are duties to treat people in certain ways defined by reference to the ways others are treated. So if we make the claim, for example, that the very plausible, well, just undeniable claim that Black people in the Jim Crow South were discriminated against. What that means is that they were subject to disadvantages relative to white people or non-Black people in Jim Crow South. It's not enough to say, you can't say they weren't discriminated against because they fared no better than white people in South Africa at the time. That's not the relevant comparison class. So what constitutes the relevant comparison class is not going to be totally clear, but it's something like, Black people in the US are discriminated against relative to non-Black people or white people because they should be treated equally by their governing bodies, like by the state or by the companies that sort of lord over us or whatever else. With increasing globalization, sometimes these comparisons will make sense if they're international as well, but we need a relevant comparison class. One interesting upshot of this is that it means that you can be discriminated against by a policy, even if that policy actually benefits you in absolute terms. So imagine, for example, that the government brings in a universal healthcare policy that covers everybody. everybody benefits relative to how they fared before the policy came in. But this policy benefits white people much more than Black people. It's still the case that Black people are being discriminated against by this policy, even though in absolute terms, they're benefiting from the policy. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the first feature of our definition. Discrimination is comparative. The second feature is that it's based on social group membership. What are the relevant social groups? I don't have some like abstract criteria to give you to determine what the relevant social groups are, but it's generally agreed upon that the social groups definitely include race, gender, religion, LGBTQ plus status, etc. So you might think that, you know, what determines what the relevant social groups are for the purposes of thinking about discrimination might be something like how your membership in that group already affects your prospects in society or something like that. Okay. So here are some of the key questions that we're going to be thinking through. So what's wrong with discrimination? When is it wrong to make predictions or decisions on the basis of protected social group membership? By protected social group membership, I mean social group membership that is protected by anti-discrimination law, but I mean sort of whatever social group membership is relevant for the purposes of thinking about wrongful discrimination. And then the further question, which I think that you guys will be really well placed to answer, where might discrimination arise in machine learning contexts? I'm sure you guys are much more familiar with the various stages of machine learning than I am, so I'd love your input in thinking about that question. So, this gets us to some of the theoretical material and machinery that came up in the reading that was assigned. So first, let's think about, in thinking about what is discrimination and what is wrong with discrimination, it's helpful to distinguish between disparate impact and disparate treatment discrimination. So rather than me just going through this straight away, bullet point wise, does anyone want to offer up the answer that they arrived at from the reading? What's the difference between disparate impact and disparate treatment discrimination? Is that Al? And Jack, we'll go to Al first and then Jack, yeah.
So disparate treatment is primarily concerned with intent to discriminate. So it requires like some knowledge on the part of the person being accused or group being accused of discrimination that they are engaging in discriminatory practice. Disparate impact is more general and it's concerned with saying that a practice has had a disparate impact or effect on a group without necessarily needing to prove that there's intent to discriminate.
Okay, good. Thank you. Jack, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with obviously what was said. I think for me, it was really interesting to think about like the differences in like when, at what time it matters, that like intent before like the policy or the discriminatory policy is applied versus thinking about after like the impact, like completely ignoring intent or what happens beforehand.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think I've only got like one thing to add to what's been said there before just sort of like going through these directly to make sure we're on the same page, which is that to say that disparate treatment involves, so Al said it involves intent. That's right and that's not right. So disparate treatment can be a matter of someone being disadvantageously treated as a result of somebody else having implicit bias. So the person who has implicit bias, like an employer, for example, might not have any intent to discriminate against the person who they have a bias against, but nonetheless, in virtue of their perhaps implicitly buying into certain stereotypes about members of that group, they are discriminating against them. This still counts as a kind of disparate treatment because it's essentially about an objectionable mental state of the person who's doing the treating, if you like. So disparate treatment is about somebody being treated disadvantageously as a result of somebody else having a kind of objectionable mental state. That kind of mental state can be a kind of animus, like you don't like people of that group, but it could also be a kind of indifference to the interests of people in that group. Like, let's say I'm an employer and I realize that I don't want to hire women because I don't want to have to pay maternity leave. Imagine we're in a country that has paid maternity leave. Now, if I realize that this has a negative impact on women, but I don't care because I don't really care about the interests of women or of my employees, then that counts as disparate treatment, even though I'm not being motivated by any kind of animus. Similarly, a case that might look more like a kind of implicit bias, you can imagine an employer who has paternalistic attitudes towards women. So tends to look over their shoulder at work more, tends to not give them perhaps more challenging tasks because they worry they're going to fail and they don't want them to fail. There's something strange about characterizing this as a kind of animosity towards women, but nonetheless, it's an objectionable mental state because it's a kind of paternalism towards women, and therefore it counts as a kind of disparate treatment discrimination. So I've gone far too ahead in my slides. I think I'm being a little arrow happy here. Maybe I'm sorry. Okay. So disparate treatment discrimination, there we go, is like a legal term. It's related to the moral concept of direct discrimination. I'm on the wrong slide again, I apologize. Every time I click on my screen, it just goes forward. I need to change that. So here's a working definition of direct discrimination for our purposes. So A engages in direct, well, this is a working discrimination of direct discrimination as it works for racial discrimination. So hopefully we could generalize this to other forms of discrimination like gender or sexual orientation. So A engages in direct racial discrimination against B when A treats B less favorably than she treats or would treat comparator individual C, partly on the basis of B's membership in racial group G. I'm not sure that adds too much on what we've already said, but it's helpful sometimes just to have a sort of formal treatment of it there. Okay, so this is essentially a matter of reasons or motives, even if those are unconscious, like in the case of implicit bias. It need not reflect any kind of animus. It may reflect simple indifference. So there's a question here, which I had considered putting to you, though I think it's tricky in a way. The question is, why is this kind of discrimination wrong? I think this is a tricky question because sometimes when something is so obviously morally wrong, it's really difficult to say, well, why is it wrong? Well, look at it. Like, obviously this is wrong. An employer refusing to hire Black people because they don't like them is obviously wrong. But giving an account of why it's wrong is actually not a trivial task. Does anyone want to just share thoughts on why this kind of discrimination, disparate treatment discrimination is wrong? Yeah, just as I suspected, it's a tricky question. Alex, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking that it should revolve around do not do a thing to the other that you do not wish to be done to yourself.
Okay.
And
so if you were...
So if I'm discriminating against someone who I do not like, and I would not like to be discriminated against based on somebody's liking for me,
okay,
then I think it's wrong.
Interesting, okay. Anyone else? Okay. Oh, Allegan?
I don't know. I guess like let's assign that all like human consciousnesses are equally valid and should be like equally treated and have the same opportunities. Being put in a membership group is something nobody has any control over. So if we were to use that as a metric to differentially treat different like individuals, it would be fundamentally, I don't know, this is again very weird. It seems like it'd be fundamentally arbitrary. And there would be no reason to incur like additional suffering on like certain groups based off of essentially like no prior justification.
Good, yeah. Part of what you said there echoes a view that is in the philosophical literature, which is that the wrong of discrimination is that you're treating some people worse on the basis of features that they have no control over. Now, one reason why some people resist that account of the wrongfulness of discrimination is that it looks like some features that some groups that we discriminate against, people do have control over whether or not they belong to that group, like a religious identity. Some religions you can simply leave. Moreover, if we developed a pill that could make you change your skin color, for example, so Black people could become white people become Black, etc., it wouldn't thereby make racial discrimination not wrongful, because now what color you are, or rather we should say color-based discrimination not wrongful, because what color you are now is within your control. So whatever is wrong with discrimination, it's not that you're discriminating against people on the basis of features they can't control. Another thing that you said was that it seems somewhat arbitrary. And I think that something like that has got to be right. We're discriminating against people on the basis of features that we think don't really play or shouldn't play a relevant role in our determination of that, how that person should be treated. Hopefully we'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, so let's have a quick look at disparate impact discrimination. So again, this is the legal term. It's related to what in the ethics literature is called indirect discrimination. So disparate impact discrimination is discrimination that imposes a disproportionate disadvantage on members of protected social group. And it need not involve any kind of discriminatory intent or objectionable mental state. So for this reason, some scholars, including Brokus and Selpst, have thought that disparate impact discrimination is a better model for thinking about the kinds of discrimination that can occur in machine learning contexts than disparate treatment discrimination. Because unless someone is intentionally creating algorithms that will have a discriminatory effect or that will treat people differently, then we've got nothing like an objectionable mental state going on here. Algorithmic discrimination need not have anything to do with anybody's racial stereotypes, anybody's animus towards gay people or anything like that. Okay. So we've already started to answer the question or think about the question, what's wrong with discrimination? So this is all sort of at this point at a very high level. Hopefully we'll bring it back to ground level with some examples in just a second. So there's two kinds of answers that you might give here, and they're not mutually exclusive, but I think that it can help to make a distinction between kinds of answers to this question. So the distinction is between claims that discrimination is procedurally unfair and claims that discrimination is substantively unfair. So procedural unfairness concerns the process via which goods and ills are allocated to different people. Substantive unfairness concerns the resulting pattern of distribution of these goods and ills. So one way to get a good grip on the difference between substantive and procedural fairness is to think about this in the context of criminal trials. So we think, for example, that someone has gotten a fair outcome in a criminal trial if they've been convicted when they're guilty and they've been found not guilty when they're not guilty. So that's a substantive criteria of fairness. A procedural criterion of fairness is something like, we don't admit forced confessions. We allow both sides to admit testimony and evidence. So usually our procedural criteria of fairness, perhaps always, are trying to get us towards achievement of the substantive criteria of fairness. We have all of these constraints on how criminal trials should go because we want the people who aren't guilty to be found not guilty and the people who are guilty to be found guilty. There are some kinds of cases, like elections, where we have a procedural criteria of fairness, but no substantive one. So whoever should, if you like, become president of the United States, for example, is just whoever has been voted on by the correct procedure by the people. There's no way, in a sense, that procedure, if it is complied with, can deliver the wrong result. So let's look at these two different kinds of explanations for what's wrong with discrimination. So you can say, okay, what's wrong with discrimination? Discrimination is wrong because it's procedurally unfair. So it involves treating people differently. Sorry, 1 second, my cursor has disappeared. Involves treating people differently on the basis of morally irrelevant characteristics. Another thing that you could say, which is also a kind of explanation of why discrimination is wrong according to procedural unfairness, is that it involves treating people differently on the basis of group characteristics rather than treating them as individuals. So I think that we've already sort of begun to approximate both of these kinds of explanations. So we've sort of already gotten to the idea that discriminating against people on the basis of race for employment is generally wrong because your race is not relevant to how well you can do a job. The second kind of explanation involves treating people differently on the basis of group characteristics. The assumption there is something like, you're not looking at my features as an individual. You're making assumptions about what I'm like based on statistically similar individuals. And that somehow does an injustice to me because you're not treating me as the full individual that I am. So to try to get a bit of a sense of this kind of response or explanation for what's wrong with discrimination, here's a quote from former President Obama. He said, "There's no male my age who's a professional who hasn't come out of a restaurant and is waiting for their car and somebody didn't hand them their car keys," because presumably they thought that they were a valet. I think that this speaks to the explanation of discrimination is wrong because it's failing to treat people as individuals. The difficulty with this kind of explanation for why discrimination is wrong is that all statistical reasoning generalizes in a way that it fails to treat people as individuals in certain kinds of way. We're making inferences on the basis of statistically similar other people. We're making inferences on the basis of the way people behaved in the past. All actuarial reasoning in a way, and definitely all ML, fails to treat people as individuals in this kind of way. We're making predictions or assumptions about features that they have or about how they will behave on the basis of statistically similar other people. Okay, I'm going to pause there just in case people have thoughts or questions. Or anyone wants to chime in.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps one relevant difference would be that something like religion, which is choosable, but a protected class, tends to be more important to people than something that is choosable but not protected. And so maybe it's a matter of, if you allow discrimination on the basis of religion, you create more like unrest in society than having discrimination on, I don't know, other beliefs that a person could have that are sort of secular, that are protected as a basis for deciding who to hire or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. In a way, that explanation is a kind of claim that discrimination is instrumentally bad. It's bad because it leads to kinds of bad consequences. Another kind of explanation along those lines that's been offered is that discrimination, at least by the state, can lead to distrust among minority groups for the people that are supposed to have their interests in mind, that are supposed to govern them. That's a similar kind of explanation, but yeah, that's very true. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly move on to my next slide. So one thing that you might think here is that if it's problematic to treat people, to base the way that you treat people on protected class status, protected group membership status, then maybe what we need is so-called race-neutral data. Or I say race-neutral data because it's much easier to say than protected social group membership neutral data. But that's what I mean. I'm using race here as a term to catch all of the sort of protected social groups. So you might think, look, we can avoid discrimination if we can just strip the data of all of those features that could lead to discrimination. So all of the protected social group status features. So as an example, PredPol is a company that produces predictive policing software. It's also the name for the particular algorithm that they produced for the LAPD. It allows the LAPD to predict where and when crimes will occur. And the purpose of this is for the LAPD to be able to then send police to those areas to try to prevent crimes before they happen. It's a little Minority Report little thing here. And PredPol says of their algorithm, it uses, quote, only 3 data points in making predictions: past type of crime, place of crime, and time of crime. It uses no personal information about individuals or groups of individuals, eliminating any personal liberties and profiling concerns. I think they mean any personal liberty concerns rather than it eliminates your personal liberties, though perhaps it does that too. And this algorithm is trained on past police reports. So this is race-neutral data. The question that I want to put to you, I don't think we'll go into breakout groups, we can just sort of discuss it in the large group, is PredPol free from discrimination? It's a little hard to answer in the abstract because we don't have all of the details, but we can sort of begin to think about where sources of discrimination might lie in an algorithm like PredPol. Where might the discrimination arise in the use or construction of PredPol? Anyone have thoughts about that? Does the fact that PredPol doesn't use protected class group membership, is that sufficient to ensure that it's not discriminatory, that it's free from discrimination?
It looks like we have Charu and then Richard.
So I think that it is like this algorithm does still have the potential to be discriminative, because you have to think about like where the data is coming from. So even if they're not collecting particular even if they're not collecting like those exact variables about like race or like even any of the proxy variables, it's likely that like if more data was collected about crimes committed by a certain ethnic or racial group, and if that was like the plurality or the majority of data fed into this algorithm to train it, then it would be more likely to it would be more likely to predict another crime in the same area. And then that would lead to like a feedback loop. So like as more crimes were, like as the police were sent to that area, more crimes from just that area would be found and then fed back into the algorithm. So it's like a continually worsening problem, I think.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's spot on. I'll call on Phil because you haven't spoken yet, and then Blake.
Yeah, I think it also relates to the like separability of some of these classes. So maybe if like certain locations have like a certain racial groups that are like highly populated, if you're using location, maybe you can indirectly be classifying like a protected class, even if you're not intending to do it. And that might tie into like the, is it implicit? I forget from before the differentiation of the terms, but yeah, it's like you might be able to predict a class without intending to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Blake.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what's been said. And I think that kind of what Shara was getting at was that if the underlying policing system itself is unfair or discriminatory, then even though you're not looking at any features like race that are, you know, directly discriminatory of individuals, then the algorithm will pick up or just like kind of reinforce the you know, pre-existing discriminatory practices that, you know, already kind of exist as like a baseline reality within the LAPD. And that's something I think that's very difficult to kind of extract from just using, machine learning.
Absolutely, yeah. It's hard to root that out. I mean, what is the data that we can appeal to that isn't inflected with that kind of bias? Was there anyone else? Sorry, I only have like on my screen about 10 of you at a time, so I'm constantly toggling to see if I'm missing anyone.
You have everybody.
Okay, great. So there's this temptation to think that if we strip the data of protected social group membership, that we'll avoid discrimination, at least in the sense of disparate treatment, you might think. We've got neutral data, we're treating everyone the same. Here's a quote from a really interesting article in the Boston Review, which calls that into question. I'm going to read it from my paper because I can't see it on the screen. Even if code is modified with the aim of securing procedural fairness, however, we're left with the deeper philosophical and political issue of whether neutrality constitutes fairness in background conditions of pervasive inequality and structural injustice. Purportedly neutral solutions in the context of widespread injustice risk further entrenching existing injustices. Neutral solutions might well secure just outcomes in a just society, but only serve to protect the status quo in an unjust one. We're going to go into, in just a second, a little bit more, and I guess briefly, because we're running out of time, in what sense data, we might think of data as being biased. This is picking up on one sense that we might think data is biased. I think that the interesting thing here is that it indicates that we can't obviously have criteria of fairness that are independent of the context in which we're making the decision or the prediction. So, you know, in the fair machine learning literature, there's a lot of discussion of these various, they're called measures of fairness or definitions of fairness, which are usually like statistical notions, things like, you may or may not be familiar with them, calibration, demographic parity, false positive equality, things like that. It's been, so some interesting things is that it's been shown that various of these together aren't satisfiable if certain background conditions obtain, like if base rates, you know, various interesting statistical results. I mean, this indicates that these aren't really capturing fairness per se. These various statistical measures of fairness are distributional features that there's some relation to the question of fairness in some cases, but not necessarily all. So you don't necessarily want to be treating everybody the same if there's an ethical injunction to make redress for past injustice, for example. If we owe people reparations for slavery, for example, then it's not clear that it's just or fair to treat everybody the same. In fact, we have reason to treat some people preferentially. So what counts as fair or not in this procedural sense is radically context sensitive, which in some ways is tough for us because it means that we can't just have a checklist of things that make decisions or predictions fair. This brings us, so we've discussed what might be wrong with discrimination in terms of procedural unfairness. It's like not treating people as individuals, it's treating them on the basis of group characteristics, something like that. Another thing that you can say, and these can both be true, is that discrimination is substantively unfair. It contributes to the over or underrepresentation of some racial groups in the most advantaged or disadvantaged positions in society. So this kind of locates the wrongfulness of discrimination on its outcomes as opposed to its processes. And so in some ways, this is more closely related to disparate impact discrimination. With disparate impact discrimination, you can say this is wrong because it has led to this impact, it has this outcome. So here is a map, which you will see in your post-lecture assignment as well. This is a map of the areas that Amazon Prime offers free same-day delivery in the Metro Boston area. So the blue is where they do offer free same-day delivery. The white is where they don't. Now, as you can see, this map is mostly blue except for this giant hole in the middle, which is Roxbury. Now, we don't know exactly how Amazon decided which suburbs to and which areas to have same-day delivery for and which not, but they claim that they don't take race into account at all, and we should take them on their word for that. What they were taking into account included the proportion of people that have Amazon Prime memberships. So presumably less people have Amazon Prime memberships in Roxbury than they do in the other areas of Boston. It's also the case that Roxbury is predominantly ethnic minority area compared to the surrounding areas. So what we've got here is Amazon using totally race neutral data to determine who gets free same-day delivery, but the result is that people in Roxbury are disproportionately disadvantaged. I'm assuming here that not having access to same-day delivery is a disadvantage. That just seems so plausible to me as a stuck-at-home millennial, I guess. But also, I mean, Amazon do provide goods at a much cheaper price than they're often available in local stores. So at least from a cost perspective, from the consumer, it's definitely a disadvantage not to have free same-day delivery. They've now changed this so that there is free same-day delivery in Roxbury. I mean, this held true for cities all across the US. In Washington, DC, in Chicago, there were holes and places in the map that were predominantly populated by ethnic minorities where there wasn't free same-day delivery. So I take that to be an example of a disparate impact, even without any kind of discriminatory intent. And even without, so we've obviously got something like proxies happening here. This keeps coming up again and again, which is helpful. So I want to think a little bit more now about the relationship in the last few minutes. I guess some of you might have to go, in which case, please do. In the last few minutes,
we're right up at the end, but I think if you want to just go for another couple of minutes, that would be okay. And I'm sure people can hang out for another couple.
Sure. So there's an interesting relationship between accuracy and discrimination. You know, if discrimination always led to less accurate predictions, then we would always have reason, just purely from an economic point of view, to root out discrimination. So there's this phrase that you've all probably heard, garbage in, garbage out. I think it helps us to think about what could this mean? What does it mean to say we've got garbage in? So two ways, so what goes into your machine learning algorithm is data, training data. Two ways that data might be garbage. First, it fails to accurately represent the world. So you've got like a bias, you've got an unrepresentative sample. So natural language processing systems that are trained on things on the internet are a great example of this, because natural language processing systems learn languages based on how journalists and white supremacists talk. And so this is not representative of how people talk. Another way that data might be garbage isn't that it doesn't accurately represent the world, but that it accurately represents an unjust world. So what I mean here is that the data that you're feeding into the system accurately captures existing patterns of prejudice and injustice, and therefore has the potential to reinforce those patterns. So for example, for those of you who are into online cooking videos during this pandemic, there's a very popular channel called Bon Appetit that's recently exploded due to racial discrimination claims. It was apparently an incredibly hostile workplace. When you've got an incredibly hostile workplace for people of racial minorities, it's highly likely that those racial minorities are going to perform worse on the job. So if you're taking into account people's race in thinking about how they're going to perform on the job, then taking into account their race is going to be predictively very useful. So sometimes discrimination is predictively helpful and gives us more accurate models. So that's two things we could mean by garbage in. Either it's garbage because it's not accurate data, it's not representative, or it's garbage because it is representative, but what it's representative of is, you might say, garbage. It's representative of a world structured by injustice. Very briefly, what do we mean by garbage out? Firstly, you could mean bad or inaccurate predictions. We've got a predictive model on the basis of which we want to make decisions. Now, if you've got data going in that isn't representative, you're going to get inaccurate predictions out. Another thing that you could mean by garbage out is that you make unfair decisions on the basis of accurate predictions. So you're accurately predicting that someone is going to perform worse on the job because they're a woman. And if you make your decision about who to hire on that basis, then you're making an unfair decision in some respects, even though your prediction is perfectly accurate. So what I'm wanting to suggest here is that the following tempting thought is untrue. Treating people fairly just requires making decisions on the basis of accurate predictions. Instead, I think the following is true. Accurate predictions do not guarantee fair decisions. So I should wrap up so I can let people go. But I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer if anyone else wants to chat. And again, thank you all for having me. Apologies that I didn't quite manage to get through everything and hear everybody's questions. If you can, it would be really helpful if you guys could fill out this survey. So this module has been a part of the Embedded Ethics at Harvard program. It's really helpful for us to get your feedback on what's useful, how it ties into your course material, all that kind of stuff. It should only take you like 1.5 minutes max. So if you get a chance to do that, we'd really appreciate it. And thanks again.
Thank you, Lyndal. Just before we break, if everybody could unmute and give Lyndal an embarrassingly long round of applause, that would be awesome.
Thank you.
And I think we are willing to hang out and chat as well. I think you have a little time still, Lyndal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. That was wonderful. Thank you. Very thought-provoking. We could have gone on for a lot longer, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying to you before the lecture started, in some ways this was a really tricky module to prepare because there is just so much material, and finding in a way a way through it and finding the most helpful and pertinent distinctions and stuff is not a trivial task.
Yeah. So Finale, I'm no longer host. Would you mind pausing the recording? Because I'm not able to do that anymore. In fact, you can stop the recording. I made Lyndal host and then I couldn't do anything after that.